Introduction to Literary Genres. So, today we're going to talk about what is a literary genre and go over a bunch of different literary genres in fiction and nonfiction. So, a literary genre is basically a type or category of literature, and it is marked by certain shared conventions of features, which means that in the genre, all the stories and texts would have those same conventions. So there are two main genres in literature, and under those, you have a bunch of other genres. So the main genres are fiction and nonfiction. I'm going to talk first about the main genres within fiction. So the first genre that I'm going to talk about is fantasy, and fantasy fiction is usually set in a world which is run by magic. You often have mythical and supernatural creatures and talking animals. There are not elements which are not realistic, and usually there is a story which is concerned with good versus evil, where the main character has to take down some kind of evil. One very popular example of fantasy is the movie Frozen and its sequel. So that has all the genre conventions. It has talking animals, it has talking snowmen, it has a character who has magic, and it has a good versus evil plotline, especially in the first movie with Elsa and the entire kingdom being taken over by Hans. And the second example is another very famous one, which most people would be familiar with, which is Harry Potter. And that is again a world which is run by magic. There is a magical school. The characters are witches and wizards. There is a good versus evil story. So it is Harry as the hero versus Voldemort, who's trying to take over. And there are talking animals like talking snakes. So it has all of those genre conventions. All right, we're going to move on to the second genre within fiction, so that is historical fiction. These are stories which are set in the past. They are based on a historical event or they are about a historical figure. They are usually about actual and fictional characters. So usually you will have a historical setting or period and you can have fictional characters or a fictional story set in that time. And a very good example of historical fiction is the movie Titanic, which is based on the famous shipwreck in 1912, where this huge boat called the Titanic crashed into an iceberg and sank, and a lot of people died. And this story is about that, and it is based on those historical facts, but it's also a love story between these two characters who are on the ship. Another great example is The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is a wonderful book. It is set against the backdrop of World War II. The main character or protagonist is a little boy who is the son of a Nazi officer, and it is about this child's friendship with a Jewish child in a concentration camp. It is set in that historical period, even though it is fictional. I'm going to move on to talk about the genre of realistic fiction. These are stories which have situations and events which could happen in real life, even though they are fictional. So they are usually set in modern times. The characters are involved in things that could happen in real life. So that's why it's called realistic fiction. A great example of realistic fiction is Bridge to Terabithia by Catherine Patterson, which is a story about a young pair of sixth graders, a boy and a girl, who are best friends, and it shows episodes of their lives, their relationships with their family, their friends, the bullies at school. So it is a very realistic story. So, I'm going to talk about the genres of mystery and horror together because there are a lot of similarities between them. The horror and mystery stories often have a lot of suspense, strangeness, puzzling events. Usually, they have a dark or disturbing atmosphere or setting, and there are always secrets or a crime. So, all of these things you can find in both the mystery and horror genres. So there are some differences between horror and mystery. In horror stories, you often have violence, ghosts, and psychological fears. In mystery, there's usually detectives, investigations, and crimes. So that's one of the two differences in the genre. And in horror, if there is a mystery, it is often supernatural or paranormal in origin, and it's not always solved. Whereas in mystery, usually there's a resolution. Now we're moving on to watch a horror movie trailer.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Sweetie?
Morning, guys.
He's not in a coma. They don't know what to call it. I went into Dalton's room. There was something in there with him. I know someone who can help.
We took tri-field and EMF readings of the whole house. Wiring, alarm clocks.
I don't think bad wiring is the problem here.
I want to leave. I want to leave this house. What is it?
It's not the house that's haunted. It's your son.
We're going to move on after that trailer to talk a bit about science fiction. Science fiction is usually concerned with the science and technology of the future. It is often set in a future world, in space, or a parallel universe. Sometimes it can be in a world after an apocalypse has happened or some kind of environmental disaster. There are usually alien societies, and it often involves an element of social commentary or criticism. A good example of science fiction would be the movie Big Hero 6, which is a really popular animated movie, and it kind of explores the good and bad sides of technology. So it's set in a world where you have all these robots and really advanced technology, and it creates a story surrounding that. So that's a really good example of sci-fi. Another literary genre is called allegory. So, an allegory is an entire story or poem which is about something else. So, it could be about animals, it could be a story set somewhere, but it has a deeper meaning and it presents a moral lesson or a political lesson. So, for example, Zootopia is a story about these animals set in a fictional world called Zootopia. But Zootopia is not just about the story of all these animals, it's also a story about racism and discrimination. And the story has that deeper meaning, so that's what makes it an allegory. Another literary genre is tragedy. Now, tragedy deals with the problems of the central character. Usually, the character is brought down either by fate or by a flaw or moral issue in his or her own character, so something that they do wrong or some flaw in their character. And usually, tragedies have a heartbreaking ending involving the death of major characters. Romeo and Juliet is a great example of this. And the final genre that I'm going to talk about under fiction is adventure. So, adventure as a genre is fast paced, it has an action packed plot, it involves danger, there's a thrilling climax, there's a character who's often going on some kind of journey, and it usually has a clear hero and villain. So, Jumanji, the movie that came out a couple of years ago, is a very good example of this. And I'm going to move on now to talk about nonfiction. And within nonfiction, I will only be touching on two main genres before we wrap this up. So, one of the main genres in nonfiction is biography, which is basically telling the life of a famous person by someone else. So, you get all the main events in their life, but it's written by another person. You can have dialogue from the character's life, you can include scenes, you can have dates and photos, but all of it would be based on facts. So, a really good example of biography is Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernoff. And this basically tells the life story of one of the founding fathers of New York, known as Alexander Hamilton. So, it tells his entire life from childhood to his death. And it was like the inspiration for the very famous Hamilton musical in New York. And finally, I'm going to talk about autobiography. So that is very similar to biography. It is the stories of a person's life, but it is written by that person. It is written in first person point of view. So a story is usually being told by a famous person, and they talk about their early life and trace all the main events which people might be interested in knowing. A good recent example of this is the late Rishi Kapoor's Khullam Khulla, which is basically Rishi Kapoor's autobiography, where he talks about his entire life in Bollywood, being a star, being the son of a star, and being the father of a star. So that is a great example of autobiography in recent times. All right, that's pretty much it. We've gone over a whole bunch of literary genres and nonfiction genres at this point. I've kind of listed them in on the slide, and I hope that you now have a better understanding of all the genre conventions. Thank you for watching and listening.